My name is Jim Finckenauer, and I am a distinguished professor emeritus from Rutgers, the State University of New Jersey. I'm very happy to accept the invitation to speak to the PALE conference, and I'm very gratified that the coordinators and the sponsors have considered my expertise to be an area that they're interested in. Just by way of a little brief background, I've spent some 50 years actually in the areas of crime and justice, including 40 years as a professor at 3 different colleges and universities. So I'm very interested in the topic, and I see a lot of issues with respect to this topic having to do with the pandemic that we're talking about here today. This is obviously a very large issue. And there are many concerns with respect to crime and justice that are related to the COVID pandemic. And I've chosen just to focus on 3 of those areas in order to get some more succinct ability to make the presentation and to have some appropriate coverage of the subject matter. The 3 areas that I'm going to talk about are common crimes, the impact on institution of confinement, such as jails and prisons, and also then, and even more so, on the problem of organized crime. Let me start with the impact of COVID and the pandemic on what we call street crimes. This is everyday crimes: robberies, thefts, auto thefts, rapes. These kinds of crimes which occur unfortunately on a kind of regular basis. One of the impacts of this pandemic has been to see a reduction in these kinds of crimes. And that reduction is largely a result of the fact that things have been shut down. People are staying at home, businesses are shut down, especially places like bars and restaurants are shut down, and therefore the people who would be congregating in these places and thus exposed as potential victims of crime are not there. So those crimes have gone down. One example of this is house burglaries. More people are staying home, and as a consequence of people staying home, fewer homes are being burglarized. The reverse, however, is true with respect to commercial burglaries. This is break-ins at business establishments. Because business establishments are closed and there's nobody around, there's been an increase in burglaries of those kinds of establishments. So we see crime down on the one hand and up in this particular instance. The other area which is quite troubling, where we've seen big increases in crime, is in domestic violence, and particularly in child abuse. And this is a particular problem because the kinds of resources and services that are generally available to domestic violence victims are also not now as available as before, and the resources have been reduced. The situations in which this domestic abuse occurs has unfortunately been affected by the stay-at-home policies. The victims have to spend all of their time basically with their victimizers, and in these times of stress and tension and so on, unfortunately, that results in greater instances of victimization. Children are at home, the stress, the tension, sometimes, again, unfortunately, that those tensions and that stress is taken out on children. So we see increases in cases of child abuse. Let me turn to the issue of places of confinement. And by these, I mean jails, prisons, detention centers, shelters. In the best of times, these are under-resourced places. Their healthcare capacity is not very good, and they're overcrowded. When you add on to that this particular health problem, where at least one of the solutions is social distancing, keeping people apart, and providing people with special personal protective equipment to protect themselves, you're adding on to you're adding a whole additional burden on those facilities. So we've seen substantial increases in cases of coronavirus in prisons and jails, for example. A large number of people have died as a consequence of these. Some of the shelters that are available, for example, shelters and detention centers where immigrants are being held. They've also been victimized through the coronavirus. And a lot of those persons, unfortunately, are children who are being subject to this victimization. So all in all, we see a bad situation being made worse. And in the US, at least, many of the inmates in state prisons and federal prisons are elderly. And as we know, the elderly people are particularly prone to being victimized through the pandemic. So this is a serious problem, and these kind of problems are likely to continue as we move into the future. Let me turn to the question of organized crime and also what I call crimes that are organized. And I make this distinction because there are traditional kinds of organized crimes that are committed by persons who are members of structured groups. These are long-standing groups that have continuity over time and over crimes and are traditionally engaged in things like extortion, protection rackets, money laundering, loan sharking, prostitution, drugs, etc. Those are traditional forms of organized crime, of which mafia is one. But then there are also what I would call crimes that are organized. These are opportunistic kinds of crimes that require some level of organization, but they don't require an ongoing structured criminal group to bring them off. Some people who have particular kinds of expertise can get together. They see a criminal opportunity, they exploit that opportunity, they exhaust the opportunity, they have the skills to carry it out. Once that's over, they're pretty much finished. So the crime itself is organized. The group doing it is not necessarily a form of organized crime. And I think those distinctions are important in this context because a great deal of what we see going on are crimes being committed of the latter kind, namely new criminal entrepreneurs pursuing particular criminal opportunities as opposed to traditional organized crime groups doing this. That said, one of the results of the pandemic is to reduce the activities and reduce the markets for traditional organized crime. They've been disrupted, largely because borders are being shut down, travel is being limited, demand has been reduced. So there's less of a market for the kinds of things that traditional organized crime does. But that said, and so as a consequence, we see a slowing down in that area. But that said, we see new markets developing. Organized crime typically responds in a supply-demand fashion to supply goods and services that are either illegal, drugs being an example, or they're in short supply, or perhaps almost no supply at all. If we look today at the kinds of things that are valuable but in short supply, what do we see? Testing for the pandemic, personal protective equipment, treatments for the pandemic, and ultimately some kind of vaccine that will deal with the pandemic. These either don't exist or in short supply, and therefore there's a black market available for organized groups, including these new groups that I'm talking about, to take advantage of those. So there's a great deal of adaptation to these new markets, and they're typically exploited through the use of frauds and scams. These are fake tests, they're fake treatments, they're fake vaccines. There's a lot of equipment that's created, counterfeit materials, counterfeit equipment that is not adequate to serve the purposes. And this is very much has come to the forefront as a new form of this kind of organized crime. What the greatest long-term danger I see of this is that the longer this goes on, that people might become more accepting and more tolerant of crimes such as counterfeiting, for example, or various kinds of trafficking. They will see that their needs for certain kinds of things that they cannot get another way override any qualms they might have from dealing with criminal figures, and therefore, as I said, they become more tolerant and more accepting of this. And this does not bode well for the future. The other thing that can happen is, particularly in societies, countries where governmental functions are weak, or where certain activities are non-existent, they're ineffective, organized crime can take over in those instances and take on government functions. This is when organized criminal groups become particularly like mafias. They're acting as quasi governmental entities, and they're providing goods and services that are more likely or more typically historically been provided by governments. This is also something that's not likely to go away quickly, and it's also likely to be a dig in of a new market for organized crime groups, mafias in particular, to assume and take control of. The other thing that happens is, because of the employment situation, so many people having lost jobs, and because of an absence of legitimate employment, we see organized crime and different forms of organized crime providing employment opportunities for young people. This is also an insidious kind of thing. It is also not something which is likely to go away quickly and easily once the pandemic has gotten under control. And it's those that I see as the most insidious of the long-term consequences of the effect of the pandemic on crime and justice issues. The other kinds of crimes and justice issues, the situations with the institutions, the situations with street crime and so on, I see as returning to some situation of normalcy. But what I don't see is that these new criminal markets and these new forms of cybercrime are likely to go away, and it's going to be a difficult problem for law enforcement and criminal justice agencies to deal with. And this, unfortunately, will be the long-term legacy of the global pandemic from COVID-19. Thank you very much for listening. Thank you very much for giving me this opportunity. I hope you enjoy this, and I'm looking forward to participating in the conference. Thank you very much.